Welcome to DMV Spotlight on ESPN 630, the sports capital, where we shine a light on local stories from D.C., Maryland, and Virginia to inform, enlighten, and inspire you. I'm Barbara Britt. Now, I have to ask, is this the year that you resolved to take charge of your finances? Is it a grim task? You're like, yeah, that would be me. Then my guest today is for you. Jason Howell is the author of Joy of Financial Planning. I know, that's what I said. Joy of Financial Planning. Mr. Howell is also an adjunct professor at the Kogut School of Business at American University. And I think I said that wrong. How do we say it?
We say Kogut.
Yes, we do. I love that. In the Department of Finance and Real Estate, he's also a certified financial planner. And I'm going to ask Mr. Howell to go ahead and start with his disclaimer.
The disclaimer is all information you hear here is considered information and not advice. Please see your certified financial planner if you'd like real results for your family.
That was so good. We're going to have to hire him. So good morning.
Good morning.
I want to start with the joy part because to me, and I know there are people I'm sure who love financial. Actually, I have several friends who are excellent financial planners, but joy is not usually the first thing that comes to mind. So let's start with that.
Well, I'll be honest, Barbara, it's not called the happiness of financial planning or the pleasure of financial planning. It is that really weird, ubiquitous word called joy. And it usually means you're going to go through some stuff before you come out of it. And when you do come out of it, you're pretty excited. You're pretty happy for what you went through. So it's about meaning. It's about transformation and what you can really do once you accomplish this discipline and habit of financial planning.
All right, that's the part I'm used to is the discipline. This is why I always fail. But that's why Jason is here to help us with this. So I really want to ask you about some of the interesting things that you have about your book and about your philosophy when it comes to financial planning. You have a term that you call family wealth. And help me understand what that is. I think we would all have an idea of what that might mean, but
Sure.
what is your intention with that?
Well, family wealth is a little derivative of family governance, and it's the first section of the 7 sections of the book. I work with my clients, and I always say we break this into 7 sections of this thing called financial planning that nobody wakes up and says, you know what, I need a financial plan today. So what is it? For us, it's 7 sections. And that first section, family governance, has to do with really looking at your family, not only your goals, but where you've come from as a family, both financially and where your values are, and what you'd like to pass along to your family going forward. So normally it's associated with the ultra wealthy. Families that have 20, 30, 100 million plus. And so when they go see a special kind of financial planner, an advisor, an attorney, and tax person, they're looking at not just making sure their kids are financially independent, they're going to be. They're looking at making sure their kids are independent, that they have values, that they have a work ethic, standards that the family sort of puts together. So this goes back a ways.
So it's interesting because I wouldn't necessarily have the financial part as a piece of that. So put those pieces together for me. Obviously, I don't want to speak for all families, but you hope as a parent to instill values of whatever your background is and what's important to you. Maybe it's faith, maybe it's being a hard worker, a contributor to society, all of those things. And it is different with every family. So that's a very interesting approach. How does that play into the financial part?
Well, I've heard it said before that any conversation around money is really a conversation around values. Generosity, being open, making sure that you're not stingy, working hard for the dollar. Really, we're talking about values whenever we're trying to communicate that to, our peers or to our children or whomever we're trying to talk about how to work with this intangible thing called money. So that's where it ends up beginning. And I know that the Brits come from a very austere background. You probably have $100 million dowry waiting for you at some point, trust fund.
Why I'm here.
So you're used to this. But most families of regular net worth, Barbara, don't get this information from their typical typical financial advisor or from the typical books they get from some of the gurus that we hear about. So I thought this is a wonderful opportunity, not just to service my clients with this, but put this in a book and let people read what has been done with the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, the Romneys, all the names you know and heard about. You've heard about them because they had family governance.
That is fascinating. And the whole book does have these 7 strategies. So the first one you said is family governance, deciding what your values are. Then how does that impact your finances? Does that mean you make certain choices of where, and not that I know anything about investments, but that where you would invest your money or how you spend your time, or how does that play out then in like your day-to-day life or even your monthly, let's say you have a monthly budget. We'll just assume that we do, but we may not.
Some of us don't need it, Barbara. I guess that's what it is.
That's not it.
That aside,
we definitely need it.
When you've got this sort of big panorama of financial planning, it includes so many categories of life. For us, we've whittled it to 7, but within that, there are more pieces. How do you wrap your mind around it as a regular human being?
Because you're busy. People are busy. People don't have hours to sit there. And yes, if someone is very wealthy, that is their job a lot of times, is to manage their wealth. But for most, let's just say, generally speaking, most people get up, they go to work. Hopefully they get a workout in. They take care of their family. They walk the dog. They might vacuum or not. And on it goes every day. And there isn't a big chunk of time until Saturday comes, Sunday, different things happen. But there may not be that time to manage even, maybe people think, well, I am not wealthy. And so, therefore, I don't need to manage my finances. What do you say to people like just average people? Do average people still need to manage their finances?
More than everybody else, right? I mean, you just said it. We're so busy. Part of why we're busy is because we're working. Part of us doesn't want to work all the time. And so if we want to sort of navigate and pivot from that choice, if we ever want this thing called quote unquote retirement, then we have to pay more attention, not less. And so the big question I'd ask someone is, why don't you think you're wealthy? Who are you comparing yourself to? The person you were yesterday or someone that's your neighbor? Do you actually know what they have in assets? I'll say to people, wealth is something you can't see. If I'm wearing a $1,000 suit, you still don't know what's in my bank account. That may have been my last $1,000. And so wealth you don't see. So when I do meet with a client for the first time, I think it's so important to sit and talk about, what do you care about? Why do you care about that? Which is actually typical. Any financial advisor worth their salt is going to ask about goals and concerns. But then I'm going to ask, maybe it's a couple, tell me about your family story with money. Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. Oh, we were really tight with money back in the day. And then Mrs. So-and-so said, oh, we always had everything we needed. And now we figured out why we argue about money. Now we figure out why I bother you about putting together a quote-unquote budget, and I spend so much, even though we don't have it, because it's where I came from. So I think the very first step for any family who's trying to wrap their arms around this is understand what the histories are, then understand what the present is. If one person works from home and the other person doesn't, works outside of the home, why? Why do you do that? Why don't you flip it? If one person is, getting an education to get a better check someday and the other person isn't, why isn't that person getting an education? Talk about the present. And then talk about the future. What do we want to do with our family? What do we want to have, but also what do we want to give? And this is an important question. What do we want our last name to mean in our society, in our community? Because it doesn't just have to be the families that we already know that make an impact. Every one of our families can make an impact in our local community. And if we pass that down to our children and, stretch across to our siblings, it will happen. And
you're not necessarily talking, I was just thinking about this morning on the way in. I was looking at buildings that have been named for people and people who are long gone, maybe.
Yes.
Especially in the Washington area. But that name does live on. And maybe it's people who, like you said, don't have gazillions of dollars. But just that doesn't mean that you don't have a contribution for the future. And it may not be on a building that is built because you gave lots of money to an institution or something. It may just be because you were able to contribute to a charity that changed somebody's life.
Well, I'll say this. On my website, on the homepage, right now the sort of slogan is, about Northern Virginia, and it's talking about taking, transferring new money into old money. because there's a lot of new wealth in this area. A lot of couples that we work with make six figures apiece. Right. And so, well, in doing that, you have to work pretty hard. A lot of my lawyer friends said, no one who's a lawyer is really rich. Otherwise, we wouldn't be a lawyer. Right. But you get compensated pretty well, but you work a lot of hours. And so we have a lot of lawyers in the Washington, D.C. area. We have a lot of professionals who do very well. And so the question for them is, how can I transfer this into something more than just putting my kids through college that I can afford? But there's more I wanted to do here. And once you start planning on the front end, whether it's estate planning, and when we die, we all have an estate, whether you made a plan for it or not, whether it's life insurance, there are opportunities you have to pass along some measure of wealth that, for all the small nonprofits we have in this area, you could make a drastic impact. And then when you think of your children, most wealth transfer is due to life insurance and doing good work with that kind of technique. And so starting out as an adult, just think if you started out as a 22-year-old with $1 million life insurance policy payout versus where you did start, how different that would be for you as an adult. Same with, any kids that you have, any kids that you know of, you can set this up now. And, sometimes whether it be an insurance policy or saving, those things are very small. They're very tangible. It's not just for the quote unquote wealthy.
That's very, very important. I think and I don't want to speak for people, but when you think about it, it is kind of overwhelming. So let's look at it. Do you recommend that the average person have like a monthly budget? Is that important for people to do?
I recommend most people are really intentional about their spending. And so last night was the night that I teach at American University, and I'm talking to 18 to 22-year-olds and trying to make all this stuff make sense to them. And when I say make sense, I mean tangible for right now. And so the largest expenses that we have that are, expenses we have to spend on: housing, transportation, food. And I'll take that to a college student, okay? So housing. Well, maybe it's on-campus housing, maybe it's off-campus housing.
Maybe they're paying, maybe their parents are paying.
Exactly, or maybe that student loan is paying.
Correct.
All right, so you're making this decision. All right, now transportation. So maybe I'm taking the bus, maybe I'm taking the metro, maybe I'm walking, maybe I have a bike. Or the last one, the most expensive, maybe I'm Ubering everywhere because it's so easy. And I would have never done taxis because I would have taken that money out of my pocket. But Uber, I would do. And then food. Maybe I have a meal plan, but maybe I just buy stuff and I go out with my friends. I talked to them and said, listen, if you have an off-campus place because it's really nice and you want to invite your friends over, but you never invite them over, and you always go out and you spend a premium at restaurants just to be social because you're a social person, then you're making some decisions here. Be intentional about it. If you like to go out, then get a place that's not that great and get a bunch of roommates because you're not bringing anyone over. Save money there and spend money somewhere else. And so it's this idea of being very intentional. If you need to get around to places, but you don't care how you do it, and if you just set more time aside, then you can take the bus and not the Uber, and you can save money there. So it's really directing money in the direction that you'd like it to have versus just wherever it goes.
So I hear you saying a little bit that sometimes it's the tail wagging the dog, that we end up making money decisions, but we don't know that we are.
Exactly. And in this book, I talk about spending. And you'd expect that, someone who's a financial advisor, the first thing I'm going to say is, you shouldn't be spending as much as you are. And I will instead say, spending is not all your fault. Kind of like, the beef, it's what's for dinner. This is the same situation. It's not all your fault. If you do the research on this, there's a whole profession called neuromarketing. And you can guess what that means. Brain science marketing. Right? And we see it online with the click to buy. We know that one. But do we really know about the one about the store window and how things are fitted and how the mannequins look? You remember mannequins 25 years ago? They were boring. They were kind of stick figures with
generic
weight on them. Yeah. Now they're incredibly attractive. I mean, you look at them, you're like, I want to look like the mannequin. Forget the clothes. And that's not on purpose. Not, right? Double negative. On purpose. They make it so that this is such an emulation. It's going to your brain and you're not looking at the mannequin, you're looking at these clothes that you think are going to transform you. This is all part of neuromarketing. There's a Neuromarketers Association. I don't remember if it's in DC, but there is one where people who study science and marketing get together and talk about how they can trick your brain to buy.
And separate you from your hard-earned money.
Exactly. So that's why I say it's not all your fault. And people carry so much guilt about, wow, I didn't mean to be a spender. I saw that in my family and I was going to be different. I was going to be a saver. I don't know why I do it. And my spouse is judging me and I feel even worse. But the reality is, without an intentional plan about things, you're going to be tricked into doing things that you wouldn't have normally done.
So you mentioned a couple of times, and this can be a huge tension point, we know, in marriages or partnerships or whatever it is, that one person does want to save or doesn't ever get rid of things. That's a different topic. And another person, that'll be next week, and another person maybe overly spends according to the other person.
That's
so
right.
That's where you have to, how do you even have that initial conversation? Are you the... Honey, it's Friday night. Let's sit down.
Exactly. How does that actually work?
Yeah, I don't know.
There's got to be space for intimacy in general between a couple. And so if the only time you slow down is talk about money, it's not going to work.
You already have issues.
Exactly.
And that's next week.
That's the week after. Exactly. And I'd be happy to come in on that one. But yeah, that reality is, are there any spaces, for you and your partner where you're just quiet and you just talk about things you like and things you don't like? And can you count those spaces? And then when you find that you've got plural of those spaces, be it in a day or in a week, then you can start carving out some time for different conversations that are important that have nothing to do with money, and then conversations that do have to do with money.
And sometimes it doesn't have to be hostile. We're not talking that you have to fight. I mean, you can have and I think this is what I hear you saying, you can have a shared goal. Yeah. We do want to take our dream trip to wherever before we're 8,000 years old, if you don't mind. And what does that look like? What is that going to mean? We do want to make sure that we have enough money for our kids to go to college, or we do. A lot of times in this area, because people are living longer, we end up, as working adults concerned about our elderly parents. How do you balance all of those demands on your one pot o' cash?
Well, that's the recognition, right? It's a trade-off. That's why, again, it's the joy of financial planning, because you're going to make decisions because you think, not the financial advisor, not the finance professor, not your parents, but you and or your partner think that this is what we really want to do combined. Okay, so if we want to do this more than anything else, do we want to do this more than going out to restaurants every other night? Which is going to mean that we're going to have to cook more. Is that worth doing? Yeah, it kind of is, to go to Europe for the first time. Then let's do that. Let's cook with the idea that we're going to be able to go to Europe and maybe take a cooking class, right? And which is going to be so fun. And now you're going to do it in the spirit of not like this is gleeful, this is a pleasure, because maybe you don't like to cook despite the joy of cooking, but because you're going to be able to go to Europe. That's where some of that family governance comes in again on that front end. You can take that concept and really extend it out, where you say, what do we want to impart in our family? In our family, we take family vacations every summer. Well, we've never found enough money to do that. Well, we haven't found enough money because we haven't actually looked at our money, and we haven't actually taken the time to organize all of our calendars. And so if it's important for our family as a principle to spend time together, and the Rockefellers do this as a large family, by the way, then let's make it a priority. And everything else kind of falls in line. So
let me ask you this in terms of, certainly in the D.C. area, you can't get far into any kind of political or policy conversation without talking about the cost of housing.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily what we're going to focus on here, but I would venture to say that for most people in this area, that is a huge chunk of where their money goes. I'm speaking today to Jason Howell. He's the author of The Joy of Financial Planning and also an adjunct professor at the Kogod School of Business at American University. And so my question is that the value question, the what's worthwhile to us question, almost needs to begin at that spot. Do we want to have a home where it depends on both of us working all the time in order to afford it? And those kinds of conversations.
And that is a good question. In this area, it's almost like you don't have a choice, right? Especially if you want to get into the right school system, then you're going to be in an area where the housing is going to be higher than a school system that's not as great, which is hard to find in some parts of this area that not a good school system. Most of them are pretty good, but you can tell when the houses are cheaper, the school systems are worse. And that tends to be the deal. If you're someone who has the capacity, because most people have grad degrees and certifications in this area, and you are, at a 6-figure pace, you are working crazy hours, and you're going to look around to your peers and you're going to say, yes, I do want my kids to be able to have more choice than I did, so I'm going to put them in a good school system. So it usually starts with that school system, which then drives the housing costs, which then makes us, forced to have the two incomes that are pretty rough and tumble, and then our hours dissipate. And that's why there is this tension between creating enough wealth to get sort of the tactile things that you want, but then having to step back and say, wait a second, am I losing things in between?
And that's the other important question is, where does that time management come into play? Because there is a time, and I don't know if it comes with age or what it is, where you sort of go, you balance between time, money, and then the older you get, the time in a lot of ways becomes more valuable. And not that it's an either or, I don't think ideally, but there are certain things. Is it worth it for me to spend 5 hours on a Saturday changing the oil in my car in the garage because I can? Who am I talking to right now? But anyway, let's move on. Or is it good to go to, the oil guy down the street who can do it for you lickety split?
$30.
So,
and it does end up being a question of priorities again. And you can't do this necessarily by default. I mean, you're very fortunate if you're a two-person couple and you are able to kind of by default do this. So what tends to happen over time is you drift and you fall into certain patterns, and a conversation can be had about those 5 hours with the oil change and say, wow, those are 5 hours that, we could have used 2.5 of those to go to the movies together. When I was buying my tux to get married, the guy at Joseph A. Bank, no opportunity to sell for them. Not that I do that anymore with Joseph A. Banks, but he was really kind, and so I'll give him the plug, even though he's not there anymore. And he said, "Would you like some advice about marriage?" And I said, "Yeah, you tell me for sure." And he's like, "All right, well, a couple things of advice. Number one, you should always date her." I said, "Oh, that makes sense. I've heard that before." And he's like, "Number two, you can be right or you can be married." Oh, okay. Got it. And I've hemmed to those as best I can. So, to force the conversation, tell them about the second, but then to kind of underscore the why, tell them about the first. And so are you dating as a couple? If you're not dating as a couple, then you're not creating some of those intimate spaces for them to be able to talk about things that are long-term important like money.
So do you have sort of, and you may not because of your approaches, but is there, you go to certain places, or you've heard over the years, you need to save X amount, you need to spend X amount, and you need to put X amount towards some goal. Is that an approach you like to take? Why or why not?
Well, there are lots of those rules out there, and they're really good. I was talking about ratios last night with the students, and I told them here are these ratios that academically are here and financial advisors repeat, like save 3 to 6 months of your expenses and set that aside. You never hear this much except in school, a current ratio. So, you take the amount of cash you have and divide that by, let's say, credit card debt. And if you have, a 1, it's good, a 2 is better. And you're like, oh, what's the 1, the 2? I say, essentially set that aside to some degree. And go back to what we said before. The competition is not with these metrics or these rules or your neighbors. It's with yourself. You full well know how much money you have today, or maybe you don't. I was asked to speak at my church at the beginning, actually the end of the year. It was, it's tithing season, right? Or it's actually not called tithing season in my church. It's just, giving. And so I stood up and I talked about this concept of tithe, that whether you go to 10%. Church or not, you've heard of this 10%. But here's the most important part of that rule, because the question was, and I mentioned this as I stood at the lectern, people wonder, honestly, if I give 10% of my money, the people on TV, the televangelists say, like, that's going to really expand my overall wealth. I'm going to be blessed. And I say, well, this isn't the Warren Buffett in the sky that's helping you, purchase undervalued securities. This is a reality. If you actually knew what 10% of your gross income was, that'd be a big deal. And it seems simple, but do you know what it is? Do you know what 10% of your net income is? How about your 10% of your net income after you make your 401k contribution or your 403b or your TSP? Do you know that number? Because once you start knowing those numbers, that awareness, yes, that is a benefit. Whether you give 10% to Barbara Britt, or whomever else, just knowing those numbers starts to make things work. So here's step one for anyone who's trying to just get started on this sort of financial journey towards joy. Know your numbers. On a monthly basis, let's say, go into the tools that are so easy today. We have all of the banks have online access now. I used to work at a bank when I was in college. Everyone had to come into my bank to get a printout of their statement.
You don't have to do that anymore.
You don't have to do that anymore. So go online and at the end of the month, actually see what's going on and see what you have. How much money do you have? How much money do you owe? The difference is your net worth. That net worth statement is the first statement you should work on. How much money do I have? How much money do I owe? Net worth. Look at that every month.
On a monthly basis.
Monthly basis.
Okay.
Then the other one is going to be kind of a cash flow income statement. How much money do I earn? How much money do I spend? The difference is what you can save. That's it. Put those two statements in front of you every month. And you as a person will want those numbers to be better. You know that difference on the earning and spending, you'll want to see that difference called savings be a little bigger. And then when you look at that net worth statement, you'll want to make sure, just because you want it, you want to have more money than money that you owe.
And that circles back to your values and what's important to you, because thinking of savings just as a chunk of money out there somewhere in the clouds, but if you're thinking of your savings for your kids, for your retirement, for that dream trip to Europe, for different things that are important to you, for maybe a new home, for maybe whatever it might be for you and what's important to you. The other thing I want to touch on, because our time always flies and there's so much more. At this time of year particularly, the holidays are over. The credit card bills have come in.
Yes.
You've gotten a violent reality check for most people.
Yes.
And I think most of us know at this point, you got to get that down. And this is what I tell my kids. If it's 25% that the credit card company is charging you to use their money, which is what they're doing, that means that for every dollar you spent at whatever store that you got your pants or wherever you're giving them an extra 25 cents a dollar. That's a lot of money.
It's a good way to put it, Barbara.
So how do we, for a lot of folks, that's sort of stealing their wealth from them.
Look at it. That's my answer. Look at it. If you put on a piece of paper or on the screen that I owe this much money, I have this much money, and then when you go to that income statement and you realize, all right, here's how much I make, here are all the expenses that I have to spend on transportation, housing, food, and then here's some stuff I like, and then, here's that minimum payment I have to pay. Oh, well, then I have to reduce the stuff I like because of that minimum payment. Far less if you were paying additional. That's going to bother you emotionally, and you don't need a financial planner to look at that to see it. You just need to see that for yourself. So I say look at it. Bring it to your own attention. Most of the clients, most of the students I work with are really smart. When they see it, they make change.
On their own.
Yep.
That's very, very powerful. For people who are facing kids heading out to college, is it too late?
Too late for what?
To make it quick. How can I make all this money right away so that I can afford their college? Or does it make sense for them to take a loan, or does it just depend?
Well, if you're in a position and your kids are heading to college and you figure, I don't have enough for the college, it's okay. Take a breath. The most important thing you can do is put the mask over your face before you put it over the kids. The kids can take a student loan. We can't do a loan for your retirement. So handle your retirement, set that money aside, and if it is your values to take care of their college expenses when they graduate, as I like to say at AU, then as parents, you can help them pay down that student loan.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is absolutely awesome. I've been speaking today with Jason Howell. His book is Joy of Financial Planning. It's a very different approach, as you might have heard today on our show. And Mr. Howell is also an adjunct professor at the Kogod School of Business at American University right here in D.C. in the Department of Finance and Real Estate, and a certified financial planner. And if you want to get more information or talk to Mr. Howell about what he does and how he does it, give us your website address.
JasonHowell.com.
And it is spelled just the way it sounds. Howell has 2 L's. As in Thurston Howell, perhaps?
As in Thurston Howell.
I'm sure there's no coincidence. Anyway, thank you for joining me today and for listening to DMV Spotlight on ESPN 630, the sports capital. I want to thank our engineer, Ken Hunter, who makes us sound so good.
Thanks, Ken.
And thank you, Mr. Howell, so much. I'm Barbara Britt on ESPN 630, the sports capital.